Hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. We are very glad to have Dr. Priscilla Callahan Lyon with us today. She is a physician and a deputy director of the Division of Individual Health Science in the Office of Science at the Center for Tobacco Products at the FDA. Dr. Callahan Lyon received her medical degree from the University of Florida College of Medicine, and then did her residency in internal medicine and her fellowship in pulmonary disease at the Eastern Virginia Medical School. She was a practicing community physician till she joined the FDA in 2008, and she has been with the FDA CTP since 2012. Importantly, Dr. Callahan Lyon is a member of the FDA's Nicotine Steering Committee. And this committee was established, as many of you know, after the announcement that the FDA director just recently made about a comprehensive plan to regulate levels of nicotine in tobacco products. The role of this committee is to advise the FDA and guide them on what kind of science is needed to implement some of these policies. Dr. Callahan Lyon has been closely involved in the development of regulatory processes that will be used for new and modified risk tobacco products, specifically on the use of ITPs, or investigational tobacco product applications, where research is conducted with these new and modified risk tobacco products. For those of you who are not familiar with ITPs, they are very similar to INDs, or the investigational drug applications that you need to get when you want to do any kind of research with a drug, device, or any kind of medication. So her talk today is going to introduce us to some of these concepts and regulatory approaches, and I know there are a lot of people here in the audience who are very interested in learning more about this new and often changing, developing areas. So, Dr. Callahan.
So I'm going to apologize in advance to anyone that heard the presentation at SRNT in February. This is a very similar presentation, but I did tailor it a little bit based on the email exchanges that we had to try to make it a little bit more geared towards the differences between an IND and an ITP and how we approach it from the process standpoint. So this is my official disclaimer. And I'll give you a brief overview of what I hope to discuss. I'm going to talk about the jurisdiction rule. I'm going to give you some basic definitions. I'll spend a little bit of time then on investigational tobacco product request and how we look at these. A brief summary of investigational new drug applications. I am not a drug reviewer, but I have been one in the past. I was for my first 4 years at FDA, so I have a little bit of experience in this regard. I'm then going to discuss how you know the difference between an ITP and an IND, and reassure you that if you don't know the difference, that's okay. We can help you with that. And then I'm going to give a brief summary of the tobacco product application review processes, both for new products as well as for marketing and modified risk situations, and then some very brief conclusions. So first up is the jurisdiction rule. So the Tobacco Control Act defined a tobacco product as anything that was made or derived from tobacco that was intended for human consumption, but it specifically excludes an article that is a drug or a device or a combination product that's regulated under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So this was confusing. People didn't know what that meant. It made it very difficult when a product was made from tobacco, but is it considered a drug or a device or a combination product, or is it considered a tobacco product? No one really knew where these things fell. So after years of thinking about it, FDA finally published a jurisdiction rule. And in theory, the jurisdiction rule provides clarity about when the product is made or derived from tobacco should be regulated as a tobacco product and when it should be regulated as a drug, device, or combination product. I included the docket number on the slide of where the published rule is, just so you know. It's only been out for a little over a year. Basically, the rule describes two circumstances in which a tobacco product is subject to regulation as a drug, device, or combination. The first one's pretty easy. If it's intended for use in the diagnosis of a disease or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, such as in the cure or treatment of nicotine addiction, like smoking cessation products, relapse prevention, again, like the nicotine replacement products, or relief of nicotine withdrawal symptoms, also for the nicotine replacement products, then it's a drug-device combination and it's regulated through the Center for Drugs. The second description here, the second condition, is a little bit more complicated and more nuanced. And that's when if it's intended to affect the structure or function of the body in any way that is different from the effects related to nicotine that were commonly and legally claimed in the marketing of cigarettes and smokeless products prior to March the 21st of 2000. My advice for that circumstance is to be aware that it exists and not spend a whole lot of time thinking about it, because it gets very complicated very quickly, and I don't think I know exactly where it falls, and I would not expect you to. So let's skip on to the next thing, which I think is the more useful part of the jurisdiction rule. And what they included in the jurisdiction rule was a pretty detailed description of the difference between a modified risk product and a medical product. And they actually provide a lot of concrete examples. This, I think, is much more useful information for the average person that's not inside FDA. So, a modified risk product, a tobacco product that's sold or distributed to reduce harm or reduce the risk of tobacco-related disease. It may have the effect of lowering the risk. It may present less risk or be less harmful, but it doesn't affirmatively act to mitigate, prevent, or otherwise treat disease. So these are products that are still a tobacco product. The users are still exposed to some inherent risks, though they may be reduced. A good example of this would be electronic cigarettes, for example, that they can be sold as a modified risk product after they go through the appropriate application process, and they specifically reduce harm or reduce risk of disease potentially, but they are not a medical product, at least not in this context. A medical product would be one that's intended to mitigate and prevent disease. So in order to be reviewed and approved under FDA's medical product category, and this would be drug, device, or combination product, it must be shown to be both safe and effective for treatment of the condition and act affirmatively to prevent the disease or health condition. So this would be your nicotine replacement products, your other pharmaceutical agents that are marketed for smoking cessation. Even potentially an e-cigarette could fall into this category if they go through the process to prove themselves to be a safe and efficacious product. So you can see the whole difference is going to be in how they conduct the studies and how things are applied. Okay? So it's a little bit of a nuance, but it's an important difference to keep in mind. So some basic definitions, which hopefully will help a little bit. A tobacco product. It's considered to be a new tobacco product under 910A1 if it was not commercially available in the United States on February the 15th of 2007, or if it was commercially available then, but somebody has made a modification to it. Then if it meets those criteria, one of those criteria, it's a new tobacco product. And what we have said about investigational tobacco products, if it's a new or modified risk product that is not legally marketed, or if it's a tobacco product that's required to comply with a particular standard and it doesn't meet those standards, and you're using it in an investigation, then it's an investigational tobacco product. So that obviously is a pretty large group of products. What is a modification? If you mess with it, it's modified. Okay? It's really fairly simple. If you change some sort of constituent, if you change the content, if you change the delivery, if you change any of the ingredients, then it is a modified product. If you modify it, it then becomes a new tobacco product. So that makes, it's a fairly simple definition for modified. Now there has been some discussion as to whether or not changing the packaging and the labeling meets criteria for modification. Just don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about that. That's still under a little bit of discussion. But basically, if you mess with the product itself, it's modified. The definition of a drug, as defined in 201G of the FD&C, is articles that are recognized in the pharmacopoeia, the homeopathic pharmacopoeia, or any other national formulary, if it's intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or animals, if it's any part of it is intended for use in this manner, or if it's an article other than food that's intended to affect the structure or function of the man or animals, then it's considered to be a drug. As you can see, that's a very, very, very large group of substances. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit with that framework and focus on the investigational tobacco products and the process for investigational tobacco products. Yeah.
Interrupt with a question?
Certainly.
Sorry, before I lose it, I forget the thought. Can you go back to a couple of slides, please? Maybe keep going. One more. And maybe one more. There was a question of legal definitions of one of them you talked about.
Oh,
what
okay.
Okay,
Should be
maybe
here.
it was that one.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah, this one.
Legally
So,
marketed.
A new modified risk tobacco product that is not legally marketed. Now,
Right.
Define the term legally to me. Like, what is legal marketing?
Actually, I'm going to get to that.
Oh, you
but
are? Okay.
I'll go through it. I'll get to that.
Okay.
Because that is an important point.
Right. Okay.
And it's coming up in another slide or so. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so 910G of the FD&C gave us the authority to issue regulations exempting tobacco products that were intended for investigational use from the requirements of Chapter 9 of the FD&C, which is a long way of saying that we have the right to write a regulation on how investigational tobacco products can be used. So far, what we have written is a draft guidance that was published in 2015, and what we stated in the draft guidance is that a new tobacco product that's on the market under an exercise of FDA's enforcement discretion is an investigational tobacco product if it's intended for investigational use. So this gets a little bit to the question that was just being asked. So what you need to understand is that a product that is on the market under an act of enforcement discretion is not considered to be a legally marketed product under the legal definition of legally marketed. That includes, for example, any product that falls into the newly deemed categories after the deeming rule was finalized in August of 2016. So all of those products that were newly deemed are considered to be on the market under enforcement discretion. They are under enforcement discretion until the compliance period expires, which is either 2021 or 2022, depending on the product. So they are not legally marketed. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to go out and rip them all off the shelves, obviously. What they're under enforcement discretion. But what it does mean is that if you were to go out, as this was written, if you were to go out and use those products in an investigation, then they now become an investigational tobacco product. So that makes it a little bit difficult, and it created an issue, okay, for investigators. So these newly deemed products that remained on the market due to enforcement discretion would be an investigational tobacco product if you wanted to use them in an investigation. So we have another statement in the draft guidance that basically said these investigational tobacco products should not be commercialized. They shouldn't be sold. They shouldn't be marketed. So it put everyone in a tough spot. It put all the investigators in a tough spot if they wanted to do any sort of an investigation using these products. It put the maker of these products also in a difficult position, because if their product was being used in an investigation, then they shouldn't be commercialized. Well, of course, they don't know every investigator that's using their product in an investigation, so they have no real way of keeping up with that, and it made it very difficult. So we published another guidance on October the 12th of 2016, and basically what this guidance does is it clarifies that FDA does not intend to enforce these pre-market authorization requirements for these newly deemed finished products that were on the market August the 8th of 2016. And we're clarifying that the compliance policy that's described in the preamble to the deeming rule also applies to these newly deemed products, even if they're used in a scientific investigation. Now, this obviously was written by lawyers, so let me translate. If the product was on the market August the 8th of 2016, and you're going to use it in an investigation and you are not going to modify it, because remember, if you modify it, it's a new product. That's a different rule. But if you're going to go and you're going to get the product and you're going to use it in an investigation and you're not going to modify it, then FDA does not intend to enforce all the pre-market requirements, even if it's being used in an investigation at the same time it's being marketed to consumers. So if you go down to your local 7-Eleven and you buy e-cigarettes that are sold there, and you use them in an investigation and you do not modify them, we are not going to say anything to you. You are good. Okay? If it's modified, if you buy it and you decide you need to fix it some way and make it better, that's a problem. Then you need to come and talk with us. If you are using what is truly an investigational tobacco product, for example, the Spectrum Research nicotine cigarettes, and a marketed product together in a study, we also recommend you come and talk to us because you've got the investigational tobacco product as well as the marketed product. But what we will look at is the investigational product. We will look at the marketed product only to make sure that its use in the study is something that is not a concern from the human subjects protection standpoint. We're not looking at the product itself. We don't look at the product if it's something that you can purchase legally. So what we've created is this category that is not a legal definition, I'm told by my lawyer friends, is legally purchasable. This is something that you can buy legally in the market. And as far as everyone knows, it's the same product that was made on August the 8th, 2016, so it meets the conditions of the guidance, and you're using it in your study, and you're not modifying it in any way, shape, or form. Life is good. FDA is happy with that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. And this is, I think, really probably one of the most important points of this whole talk, is what you can do in terms of these newly deemed products. So the basic process for an ITP request, what we ask you to do first is submit a request to use an ITP. You submit it to Center for Tobacco Products. We look at the application. We basically make sure that it does involve an investigational tobacco product, something that's actually under our jurisdiction. We make sure we can actually open it if it's electronic and we can read it and everything's identified and there's a protocol included in there. We can't review it if there's no protocol, obviously. After we've done that, then we do a multidisciplinary scientific assessment for use of that particular product or products in the context of the protocol. So the focus of the review is use of this product or these products in this particular study design. We're not thinking about the product from any other way except how it's going to be used in this particular study. And after we have completed our review, we let you know what we think. The basic focus of our assessment is whether or not that the use of the product as proposed raises any concerns for human subject protection. And so what I've put on here is the kinds of things that we look at. And this is not necessarily a comprehensive list, but it is, I did try to list the things that are more likely to get comments back from us. So things like the appropriate study population. Generally, it's adult tobacco users. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but if you're going to use a different population, we need pretty clear reasoning as to why that is the appropriate population. Youth, for example, or women that are pregnant, or other high-risk groups. It's not that we would say no necessarily, but we just need to know what your plan is and how you're planning to do it and how you're planning to make sure that there's adequate protection for the subjects in that particular type of protocol. The level of exposure to the investigational tobacco product. Here again, there's no magic answer to this, but we don't want people having the risk of getting a significantly higher level of exposure to the investigational product over what they're getting in their normal habit. So we wouldn't want you to give a 3-month supply to someone that's a very low cigarette user and not having any way of keeping up with how much they're actually using. We're very conscious of the fact that when people get free products in a study situation, they sometimes change their use pattern, like almost always. And so we're aware of that, and we do expect some compensation in terms of giving them enough to actually get what you need out of the study, but we don't want to push things too far. So that's one of the things that we look at. We look very closely at making sure that there's appropriate requirements for contraception and pregnancy testing for women. Unless it's a study involving pregnant women, We want to try to do what we can to make sure that the women don't get pregnant while they're enrolled in the study, or if they do, that there's appropriate withdrawal criteria for having them removed from the study. Now, we are well aware that millions of women that are pregnant smoke every day. So this is one of those, there's a fine line between the investigational product and what they're already doing, but we don't want to be promoting that if we can avoid it. Ensuring the investigational tobacco product is appropriately labeled and controlled. And so what we mean by this is if you're doing a study and it's in the laboratory setting, they're not going to take the product outside of the lab. You're having them come in, they use the product right there in front of you, you do whatever measures you're going to do, and then they leave without the product. Great, no problem. If they're taking it outside of the lab, we do want to try to do what we can to make sure that the person that is enrolled in the study uses the product and that the people that are not enrolled in the study do not use the product, or at least are warned that this is an investigational product and they are not supposed to be using it. So clearly we're not going to have you stamp every single research e-cigarette, but you should put it like in a Ziploc bag with a big label on it. Research product, don't use it if it's not for you, some other type of labeling. And we ask you to tell us in your protocol what your plan is for that. And also, the other thing that we would like to see, if possible, is some sort of an idea of how you're going to control access to the product. So are you going to have them bring back the ones that they don't use? Something. We just assume these things not go out and never come back. If they're not used by the study participant, then they should be returned to you so that you can dispose of them correctly. Avoiding perception of modified risk by participants. This is a little bit tricky, and sometimes it's very subjective. But we do look at like recruitment language and other things in the script to make sure that there's not anything in there that implies that the product has FDA approval or that FDA has sanctioned this. We allow these investigations to go forward, but we don't want anyone thinking that this product is necessarily an FDA approved product. So it's a little bit of a fine line, but generally, if you can avoid using FDA and approve anywhere in your application, you're better off. It's just easier to not say anything. You can let them know that FDA has reviewed the protocol, but we don't want anything that would make it seem like that FDA has approved the product, or any other statements about the product's advantages or disadvantages. So like if it's an e-cigarette, don't promise them that it's going to help them quit smoking because you don't know that. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. And then making sure that there's appropriate monitoring and adverse event and adverse experience reporting, just a statement of what you intend to do, how you intend to monitor it, how you intend to keep up with it, and what actions, if there's withdrawal criteria or other things that are going to be done as part of the study, then let us know that. We also assess to see whether or not that the study design looks reasonable, that it can be well controlled, and that it appears that the data is going to be somewhat reliable. Now, most of the studies that are coming in that we've seen to date are coming from academic institutions that have already been through either a grant review or an IRB review or multiple grant reviews and multiple IRB reviews. And so this is not usually a problem because they've been looked at. So we look at them, but we have not had an issue with this. But in general and in theory, this is something that we do think about. In the drug world, this is a bigger deal when you're talking small companies that may be doing studies that you know are not really going to do anything of value. And if we know when we look at it that a study is not going to provide any valuable scientific information, then that in and of itself can be a human subject protection issue. So we have this included in our guidance mostly for completeness. One important note, I put it in red here, we do not look at protocols that don't involve actual administration of a tobacco product and its use by a human. So an animal study or a perception study, you do not need to talk to us. Have a good time. A little bit of an overview on investigational new drug applications. So for the regulatory authority, now the new drug applications, as you're aware, there are regulations for this one. 505A of the FD&C requires that a new drug that's going to be an approved marketing application, that it has to be have an IND in effect before it can cross state lines. And we have exempt that's how they get exempt from the crossing the state lines rule. So an IND basically is the means by which a sponsor can obtain permission to have the investigational new drug cross the state line, and allows them to ship it for investigational purposes. So when you're doing a clinical investigation of a drug subject or a biological subject, these are all subject to licensing provisions of the Act, and it's not limited to clinical investigations that are supported in support of a drug application. So an IND, as was mentioned earlier, is required for any sort of a clinical investigation, whether if it's drug that's being administered, dispensed, used, involved in one or more human subjects, except for the use of a marketed drug in the course of medical practice. So what this does allows physicians in practice to make the decision to use a particular drug product in a means that may not necessarily be the way it was described on the drug package. It allows for the practice of medicine, basically. But if you're going to do this for an investigational purpose, then you need an IND. It gives physicians in practice a little bit of flexibility to use clinical experience. So for example, if a doctor has previously used a particular drug for treatment of a condition that might be a little bit unusual and they got good results, they could potentially try that same drug again for the next person they see with that condition without having to go talk to FDA about it. But if they decide they want to do a study of using that drug for that particular condition, then they need to go talk to FDA about it. So the whole role of the IND is to ensure the safety and rights of individuals who are going to participate in the studies, making sure that the studies are planned and conducted by qualified individuals, and ensuring the scientific quality and adequacy of the studies. The second bullet sounds very obvious, that qualified individuals, what does that mean? Actually, you'd be surprised some of the stuff that we see. There's some very interesting stories at Center for Drugs on different types of people that have come in investigational situations where they're making it in their garage and other things. I wish I could tell you this was a joke, but it's not. So yeah, there's pretty much all of these rules. There's a reason for them. And usually there was a bad experience that resulted in the rule being written. So the basics of the IND process: you submit the IND, FDA will assign it a number and forward it to the appropriate review division, and the review division will acknowledge receipt of it. Then CDER does the same sort of thing. They do a multidisciplinary scientific assessment in the context of the protocol. The investigation can't begin until the IND is in effect and the sponsor is in compliance with IRB. That's part of the rule. And they also have to have informed consent from the participants. The sponsors can request IND exemptions. There's some specific statements for that, and those are in CFR .2b. I didn't outline them here because I don't think it really matters to this particular group. The important difference is an IND will go into effect in 30 days. So once you submit your IND, CDER has 30 days to tell you no. If they don't tell you no, then that's a yes, okay? And so they can either give you a yes ahead of the 30 days, or they can put you on hold, or you can go. That's it in a nutshell. If it's on hold, then you cannot start, and if you have started, if it gets put on hold after it's started, then everybody has to be taken off of the product unless FDA determines that it would be dangerous to take someone off of whatever the study product is. So now kind of the nuts and bolts of IND versus ITP, and I've got some considerations and some examples. Sometimes it's not always clear. So we have developed, after experiencing that it wasn't always clear, even within FDA, let alone to people outside of FDA, which group should be looking at a particular protocol. And we have now developed a cross-center FDA task force, and the task force job is to look at basically tobacco product studies and decide whether they should be evaluated by the Center for Tobacco or by one of the medical product centers, usually CDER, but sometimes even the Center for Devices. The general default involving a tobacco product study is that it is considered to be an ITP unless something about the study makes it fall into the definition of a drug, device, or combination product as described in that jurisdictional rule way back on slide 3. So for the most part, if it's a study involving a tobacco product, it's going to fall under the Center for Tobacco Products and the ITP pathway. We do know and fully expect that over time there's going to be products that are going to actually fall into both pathways. So a lot of it's going to depend on how the study is put together and what the overall framework of the process is. But for right now, most of the time it comes to CTP. So what we look at the purpose of the study, particularly the hypotheses and the objectives. So we look at what the stated objectives are of the study and does it support the stated objectives in terms of the study design. We look at what's the therapeutic endpoint, the primary objectives and the secondary objectives. And keep in mind now, and you all know, there's only so many measures that can realistically be used in a tobacco product study. And so a lot of these measures are going to be used in both drug product and tobacco product studies. So the cigarettes per day, the liking, the appeal, the addiction measures, it's perfectly reasonable to use those in both types of studies. What we look at is what are we trying to get out of this study? So we look at the nature of the product. Is it a made and derived for tobacco? If it's not made or derived from tobacco, then it's not going to come to us. But we also look at what is the study designed to do? And at least based on the information that we have, does it appear that this study is a part of a drug development plan? Now, in some conversations earlier today, one of the things that I want to make really clear is we have made the decision we're not going to try to guess the motivation of the investigators. We can't do that. We only have what we've got in front of us, and we cannot run the risk of treating academic investigators versus tobacco company investigators or other non-academic investigators differently. So we have to look at what we've got, and that's what we look at. And we look at the objectives, we look at the hypotheses, we look at what the study design is, and we try to essentially determine what the investigator is trying to accomplish with that study. That may or may not be what the investigator's 5-year, 10-year, 15-year goal is, but I can't look at that. I don't have any way of judging it. So it's really focused on what we have in front of us. So in terms of the study objectives, I've got a couple of examples here. And okay, so if you recognize any of these studies from my cryptic descriptions, I apologize. So example 1, this was a study that we received that looked at low nicotine cigarettes and the nicotine patch. So the objective of this study was to evaluate the impact of the low nicotine research cigarette with and without the nicotine patch on exposures and smoking behaviors, dependence, withdrawal, quitting, intent, perceived risk, etc. And they also looked at cardiovascular function. So this was considered an investigational tobacco product study. Why? It involved the low nicotine research cigarette, not a marketed product, therefore it's investigational. The evaluation was to look at use patterns of smokers. There was no evidence that the investigator was trying to get people to quit. That's not to say that they wouldn't be happy if they did. If they did, that'd be great. But that wasn't the purpose of the study. And they also were looking at withdrawal measures and other topography. So why it is not an IND? The patch is a lawfully marketed product. It's exempt under IND requirements under FDA's regulations. And the low nicotine research cigarette was not intended to be used in this study in a way that would make it a drug, device, or combination product. So it's not part of a drug development plan. And like I said, the same measures apply on either way, but that's not the point of the study. So this one was reviewed under the ITP process. Does that make sense? Okay. So the next example, this was low nicotine cigarettes and e-cigarettes. So in this case, what they were doing was examining the effects of low nicotine cigarettes and e-cigarettes on compensation, toxicant exposures, liking, reinforcement, patterns of use, etc., in daily and intermittent smokers. So again, you have your investigational product, the low nicotine cigarette. The e-cigarette device and liquids that were being used in this study were marketed prior to August of 2016, and the investigator was not modifying them. So they fall under the October 2016 guidance, and we don't need to even look at the e-cigarettes except to make sure that as they're being used in the protocol that that's okay, but we didn't look at the product itself. The study was focusing on abuse liability and consumer behavior when the only cigarette available to the users was this low nicotine cigarette, and the e-cigarettes were an alternative nicotine source, so we were looking at what that did to how people used their cigarettes. And we looked at withdrawal symptoms, they looked at craving and satisfaction, but the focus was dual use, not cessation therapy, so it fell under the ITP purview. It was not an IND. The low nicotine cigarettes and the e-cigarettes were not intended to be used in a way that would make them a drug, device, or combination. Again, same as before, it is entirely possible that people could potentially quit smoking on this study, but it was not a cessation study. Okay, make sense? Okay. The third one, this is a heated tobacco product and cigarettes. So in this particular case, this actually came from a company, not from an academic investigator, and they were looking at clinical risk points in smokers who switched to this heated tobacco product compared to those who continued to use their cigarettes. So the investigational tobacco product was the heated tobacco product, which is not marketed in the United States at this time. And they clearly were trying to develop this product for the idea of pursuing a marketing application in the future. I mean, they state that right straight up point blank in their application. So the study is focused on the product as a smoking alternative. Again, it's not designed to be a cessation therapy. What they were looking at was what do smokers do when they get this product for free and how do they use it? The heated tobacco product is not intended to be used in the way it's a drug or device or combination, therefore it's not a drug. And it was not part of a drug development plan. In fact, it was specifically stated it was part of a tobacco product development plan. So it clearly did not fall under the IND purview. Next one is a traditional and an electronic water pipe use. This one's a little bit more tricky. In this particular case, the investigators were evaluating smoking behaviors and the acute physiological exposure and responses, particularly blood pressure, between a traditional water pipe and an electronic water pipe. Okay, and they were looking at how the people used it, the likelihood of future use of water pipes from these traditional water pipes versus an electronic water pipe. So both the traditional and the electronic water pipe were considered investigational tobacco products. Now, why is that? These fall under the newly deemed products rule, and there was no information about when these products, when the traditional water pipe was created, so to speak. E-cigarettes, we have a fairly good idea of what was available on August the 8th, 2016 and what was not. You know, it's not perfect, but they're fairly new, and it's easier to come up with paperwork for that. Water pipes are a different category altogether. They've been used for centuries, but I don't know that anyone ever wrote down exactly which ones were marketed on which day. And so basically there's no way that they can tell us for sure that this one was available on August the 8th, 2016, and it would fall into the enforcement discretion group. So both of these were considered investigational tobacco products. And the study involved administration of the tobacco product and measures of smoking behaviors and other physiological changes. And the focus was on using the water pipe as a smoking alternative, not a cessation therapy. And the real focus in this study was whether or not that people that use a traditional water pipe would be satisfied using an electronic water pipe, which theoretically may have slightly less risk associated with its use. This one was kind of a tricky one. It raised a little bit of angst across Center for Tobacco because basically we don't like water pipes in any way, shape, or form. But they only enrolled current water pipe users, so it made it a little bit easier to stomach, so to speak. The water pipes were not intended to be used in any way that would make them a drug or a device or a combination product. It was definitely not part of a drug development plan, so it clearly wasn't an IND. It was an investigational tobacco study. Okay, and the last one was one that's even more bizarre. So in this particular case, they were having water pipe smokers, young adult water pipe smokers, inhale 0.3% carbon monoxide and evaluating the effect of the gas on their coronary endothelial function. And so what they did, they used the tobacco product, the hookah, In this particular case, they were able to show that this product was marketed prior to August of 2016 and therefore was covered under the guidance. And the investigational product was actually the carbon monoxide. So the carbon monoxide is not a tobacco product. That's a drug. So good news, Center for Drugs, this one's all yours. Center for Tobacco was highly relieved, and we've passed that off to them, and I have no idea what they did with that study, but it wasn't us. So I was glad to see it go. But there actually have been other studies done of this nature, and I cannot even imagine giving consent to willingly inhale carbon monoxide, but apparently people are willing to do that. But that's good for them. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk 2 or 3 slides on the tobacco product application review process. This is kind of like the next step, what happens after. I don't anticipate that most of you will ever be involved with this, but you may hear about it, and it may make it a little easier to understand the preliminary stages if you know what happens next. So the pre-market tobacco application, this is how you get your marketing authorization from FDA to market a new tobacco product. Okay, it's the primary way to get authorization for a new tobacco product. You don't have to compare it to a previous tobacco product. It's under the FD&C, it's a 180-day review. The applications will undergo a significant substantive scientific review. It's multidisciplinary, and we may go out and inspect the clinical sites and the manufacturing sites. We may sample some of the products and do other testing. The final action for a PMTA application is either marketing authorization or no marketing authorization. So you either get a MO marketing order or no NMO or no marketing order. And there will be post-marketing reporting that's required, and then that will be described in the letter when the authorization is given, and the details of what is required will vary depending upon the product and on the application, depending on what we saw in the application as to whether or not that there were specific things that we're concerned about. For example, how many of them are sold to youth or other things along those lines. Modified risk, I wanted to spend a little bit more time on modified risk because I think this is an area of a little bit more confusion. So modified risk products are tobacco products that are sold or distributed to either reduce harm or reduce the risk of tobacco-related disease. This is with commercially marketed products, and this can include the label, the labeling, and advertising, and this will specifically or implicitly state that the product is less harmful and presents less risk, or that the product or its smoke produces a lower level of exposure. Okay. Now, modified risk has a lot of consumer perception work associated with it. So what's modified risk to us may or may not be what's modified risk to the general public or the people that will buy the product. And because it's not particularly well defined or described, there's a lot of discussions as to what it actually is. And it kind of reminds me of the old-fashioned talks about pornography. It's one of those you'll know it when you see it type things. Only in the case of modified risk, I'm not even sure that that's true. So we're still working out some of the details of this and how we're going to evaluate it. There's some things that are very easy. So if they describe it as light, mild, low, or other similar descriptors, those are pretty easy. We can eliminate those. But what about cool, or less harsh, or less heat? What do those mean? What does that mean to you? What does it mean to somebody that's going to use it? So it's really can be a very tricky line. Modified tobacco product all orders are for individual products. It's important to keep that in mind. It's not for an entire class of products. And they're only valid for a specific duration, and they have to apply for renewal. And we can remove it early if we have reason to. And the other thing is that it has to be related to a product that's going to be on a market. So you can't come in with your modified risk application for a product for which you either don't have or have no way of getting a marketing order for, because the modified risk is approving the labeling. So it either has to be something that was marketed either through a substantial equivalence or a provisional product or some other way to get it to the market. A couple other things about the modified risk applications that might be of more interest to you. One of them is the entire redacted application is available on the docket. Now, depending upon the size of the application, it can take a very long time for those to become available on the docket. The current application that we have from Philip Morris International for their ICOS modified risk product, I think most of it has finally been uploaded, but this was a gigantic application, over 2 million pages if it had been print. And you can only imagine what it takes to redact something of that size. So it has literally been a month's, almost over a year-long project just to get the redacted application posted online. Modified risk applications must go to the Tobacco Science Advisory Committee for recommendations. These are public meetings anyone can attend and either submit comments to the docket or ask for time to speak. Generally, we review the modified risk applications in 360 days. Again, it undergoes substantial scientific review. The final order is either a modified risk order or a denial or a response letter. And so what the response letter can be is that we're not going to say no, but we're not going to say yes until you tell us the answers to these questions. And we give them some things to respond to. There is post-marketing surveillance and activities that are expected. And if it's a new tobacco product, then a marketing authorization is required either through the PMTA, the substantial equivalence, or the exemption from substantial equivalence pathway. This is what I was saying before. You can't get a modified risk claim for a product that's not on the market. It has to have a way to get on the market. Now, you can submit your pre-market application and your modified risk application at the same time, but you can't get the modified risk order if you're not going to get the pre-market order. We're not going to do it that way. So only one slide of conclusions. Okay. ITP versus IND. So the determination of whether it's an ITP or an IND offer requires some careful analysis, and we will help you. There is a task force. We can help you facilitate communication with the appropriate center. We can help you if you have just a general question as to how do I start, what do I do. The study objectives, the hypotheses, and the stated purpose are a key part of the differentiation between ITP and IND. And smoking cessation, withdrawal symptoms, cravings, and other frequently used measures in the use of tobacco products and the way we analyze use of tobacco products can certainly be part of an ITP study measures. They're typically secondary outcome measures, but there is no prohibition. I think there was some concern at one point in time that no one could ever measure cigarettes per day because if people quit, then that made it a drug study. That is not the case. It's really the focus of what does the study involve and what are you trying to accomplish with the study. And with that, I will stop and try to answer questions.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, thank you so much. So this is like dream come true regulation. So one question, I mean, I think that it looks like there's a real different threshold for, ITP versus, for product or an IND, I mean, or the safety data, whatever. So say one of the products show really, even though they try to make it sound like it's a harm reduction, but say more than 60% of people quit smoking, and then the same product tries to go to an IND, will there be like huge roadblocks for them? Because one of the issues, what it does also, this really shapes the field.
Yeah.
So we play these games like everybody else, like no, it's not smoking cessation, this is
Right.
We're just gonna, so.
Yeah, no,
what's
your
the
question
big
is a
picture?
very good question. And I think that kind of gets back a little bit to some of what the commissioner has been trying to do with the Nicotine Steering Committee. And without, I can't give you a concrete answer because the Center for Drugs has their own criteria. And you do have to keep in mind that there is a difference. There is a big difference between saying a tobacco product is safer or more appropriate for the public health than currently available tobacco products, and saying that it is safe and efficacious as a drug product. Those are two huge groups, and they may overlap a little bit, but they probably don't overlap much. Okay, so there's, the Center for Drugs has very strict criteria for what is considered to be safe and efficacious, and that is the criteria that you have to meet in order to get a drug marketing approval. It has to be both safe and efficacious. Now, there has been some discussion as to whether or not that we can come up with better ways of evaluating a nicotine replacement type product that would deliver nicotine and hopefully aid with smoking cessation, but not have to go through all the stuff that you have to go through for an IND, particularly some of the non-clinical testing. There's been a lot of discussion about that, and there are people that feel quite strongly that CEDAR's requirements are too difficult to meet, that they have a lot of things that they want. But unfortunately, there's not really a good way of paring that list down when you're talking about an inhaled product. And so I think one of the ways that could hopefully get around it would be something that wasn't an inhaled product. But then you get into well, if it's not an inhaled nicotine product, it doesn't get to the brain fast enough to satisfy people's urges and meet all the other things that smokers want. So that paradigm still exists.
So efficacy or potential efficacy is not, it might be necessary but may not be sufficient. For example, think about other fields, like if you have a medication for depression or an intervention, if it's more effective than the gold standard, which is like, say, whatever, Prozac, then I can come and say, hey, make my case for that.
You can make your case for efficacy. Safety, you're still on your own. You still have to show safety.
So if this e-cigarette product beats Chantix,
You still have to show safety.
yep, got
That's
it.
the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, efficacy is actually a little bit easier to do in a lot of situations, not always, but frequently. Safety is the issue.
So just a quick question about the PMTA, the pre-market tobacco product part.
Mhm.
You said that it doesn't require comparison to predicate tobacco product. I understand, so when they're doing the modified risk claim, I think I understand that conceptually, you have to show that it's reducing the risk. And when you're doing this substantial equivalence application, you're showing it's not an increased risk relative to something that exists. But when they're doing the pre-market tobacco product application, how are you deciding whether it's acceptable if you're not comparing it to something that exists?
Well, the reality is most of them do compare.
Oh,
Okay, but they do not have to. It is not written into, as opposed to come in with a substantial equivalence, and apply for a substantial equivalence ruling. You have to say, okay, this is my predicate problem, and I'm telling you that my new product is substantially equivalent to this predicate problem. You have to name your predicate product, okay? That in and of itself has caused some angst, because sometimes the product that they pick are like in a completely different class, and you're like, how can you possibly think that these are equivalent? But anyway, another story. But that's what they have to do, okay? For the PMTA, they don't have to necessarily name a predicate product. They just have to show that their product is appropriate for the protection of public health. And in some cases, they can compare, but even the comparisons can be a little bit challenging to interpret. If you've got a completely new class of tobacco products, you can do some studies and you can show, HPA, the harmfully and potentially harmfully constituent levels. You can show that the nicotine exposures, you can show all these different things related to use of this product. And you may have a little bit of information about how people are using the product in a controlled situation, whether they're given the choice of either smoking or using this product. but you're not really going to have a whole lot of information on how people are going to use the product if it was put on the shelf and they could buy it. Are they going to use just it? Are they going to use it with their cigarettes? What are they going to do over time? And so that's the reason why we can't really tell them that they have to have a predicate, because that would really be very difficult for them to do if it's a new class of tobacco products. So they don't have to do that. They just have to show us that it's appropriate for the protection of public health, which is almost as well defined as modified risk. Yeah.
I understand that the turnaround time from the FDA when they receive an ITP application is within 60 days, is that right?
That's what we aim for.
We aim for? Okay, I just need to know from the IRB perspective, do you require IRB approval to be submitted with that application to
No.
the investigator?
No, what we ask for, actually, okay, I'll make 2 points. One, right now we do not have any rules associated with investigational tobacco products. We have a draft guidance. We don't even have a final guidance. We have no regulations. Okay, so anything that you do with investigational tobacco products is to make us happy, but not because it's a rule. Okay, generally making FDA happy is what most people like to do, but it's not a rule. But for the IRB, what we ask is that they have a statement in their protocol to the effect of, we will get IRB approval before the study begins, or some other appropriate language. If they can tell us what who their IRB is, if they have a name for it, which for you guys it's pretty clear, but sometimes it's not. But for most academic institutions there is only one, so they know who it's going to be. And if you can tell us who the IRB is, that's great. Sometimes they've already gotten IRB approval, and even better. Sometimes not. One of the things that we've tried really hard to do, and this has been a little bit of a transition over time, when we first started looking at investigational tobacco product protocols, that was 5 years ago. We were new to the process. Most of the people involved in looking at them had never looked at anything like this. They had not done review work. There were a few of us that had come from Center for Drugs and had done it before, but a lot of the scientists had not. So this was a new thing for them. And they would look at them and they would generate a list of comments back to the investigators that would stretch from here to that door. You ask a bunch of scientists, and you ask a bunch of scientists to look at any given protocol, and everybody's going to have 5 or 6 comments on how they could do it a little bit better. We have worked very hard to try to hone down our comments and focus on the true human subject protection issues, and also to not spend too much time overlapping with what we think that the IRBs are going to look at. Now, there is a little bit of overlap. There has to be some overlap because you're looking a little bit at the same things. But for example, trying not to give them not dictate. You have to do it this way. More, have you thought about? Consider this. And that was part of the reason why I gave you the list of the types of things that we try to look at. And it's not a comprehensive list, but I tried to keep it. These are the things that are the most common reasons for us to say to someone, yeah, maybe before we issue you a letter, you can consider doing this. And what we get, and what I didn't put in here, was what you get at the end of the process from FDA is a letter of no concerns. Okay, and the letter basically says, based on what we have for use of these products in this protocol, FDA does not have concerns. And then it goes on to say, let us know if you have adverse experiences associated with use of the product, and if you change something, please let us know, because that may change our assessment. So if you're going to go in and make a major change to your protocol, now if it's just a minor change to the protocol, or you're fixing the typographical error that somebody found on page 6, or something like that, please. But if it's a major change that you've decided you're going to completely change the subjects or you're going to add a whole new study arm or take away a whole study arm or a change of measure or something, yeah, we ask you to let us know that.
Can I
Yeah.
actually follow through on that and ask a couple of questions? So from a practical perspective, if an investigator wants to do a study with a product and modify it, and they want to submit an ITP to you for approval, what would you require that they submit with the application? And the reason I'm asking this is because when it comes to drugs, you know, there are usually investigators' brochures which have outlined everything that has been done with the drug. That's what the IRB uses to actually make
Sure.
some of their risk determinations. With some of these products, I'm assuming all that is not going to be available. And is that something that you're going to require at some stage? Is that something you require now? And or do you have enough to have enough information about the product at your end to make a decision? So, for example, if I have an e-liquid and I want to modify it, and I know it's made by a particular company, will you actually require us to submit any information from that company to support our application?
That really is almost on a case-by-case basis. It's a very good question, and it's perfectly legitimate. There's a couple of ways it can be addressed. If you're working with a particular, e-liquid's a good example. So you're working with a particular company, you have a particular e-liquid, and you want to do one little thing to it, maybe, for your particular study. And if the company, for example, is aware that you're doing this, and maybe they don't even have to be financially supportive, but if they're like intellectually supportive of this concept and don't have a problem with it, one thing that they could do, if they would, is that they can submit information about their product as a tobacco product master file. Okay, so they can send all their commercially confidential information on all the ingredients and all the other stuff associated with their particular e-liquid into a tobacco product master file, and what happens is that it sits there and nobody can see it, okay, until someone references it. So if then you were going to use their product, they would issue a letter saying, I give this doctor permission to use to have FDA access the master file and use the information in it for referencing that information for her study. Okay, and they give, you know, we can either access the entire master file or they can restrict it to only certain parts of it. Okay, and then we can go in and we look at the master file, and that gets us all the product information that we need. And then we look at the protocol, which hopefully would tell us we're going to make this little minor tweak, and our chemist and engineers or whoever else needs to would look and see at what we had and what's being done and make sure that we think it's reasonably safe. Now, e-liquids and e-cigarettes in general are kind of a bit of a problem, and part of it is because we know there's thousands, hundreds of thousands out there. They're all different, and obviously people are using them all day long, every day, and they're not dropping dead on the street like flies. So clearly they don't have immediate toxic results. And so it makes it a little bit difficult to get too paranoid about it, but at the same time, when you're talking about doing it in an investigation and something that has been at least looked at by IRBs and by FDA and by others, you know, you don't want to be trying to explain that to NBC News either. So somewhere in between those points falls the reality, and that's where we try to stay. But it is a little bit tricky. But the master file is a way to get confidential information from the company if they're willing to do it. If they're not willing to do it, then we tell people to give us everything that you can find. Sometimes they have ingredient lists posted on their websites. You give us what you've got, and then we take a look at it, and we try to look at what's being proposed, what's being done, what the modification is, and whether or not we think that that modification in a product that's already out there and already being used, will that modification make a big difference in terms of human safety, in terms of this study? And sometimes we say, no, we don't think it will. But it really, we have to look at them one at a time in order to make that determination. It's very difficult.
components in and of themselves, where they're intended almost to exist interchangeably, so you have a large number of permutations that could be used. Would a similar type of concept apply to that in kind of outlining the way it's going to be studied or studying the individual components?
Pretty much, yes. I mean, and so these multifaceted products that have any number of permutations, what those companies are going to figure out is that we consider each one of those a separate product. And so while they're available right now, I'm suspecting that when 2021 rolls around and they have to start submitting their application, they're going to figure out pretty quickly that it's in their best interest to narrow that list down a bit. Because some of them, there's just no way, they can come up with enough data to support 100, 200, 500 different products.
In terms of our researchers, perhaps looking at some of that, would this be an appropriate process?
Yeah, I think if I were a researcher, I would probably try to keep my list fairly short, and in terms of the number of permutations that would be allowed, and also consider like maybe taking a low, medium, high type approach. There probably will be the ability to do some extrapolation between two different points on the scale, so to speak, like low nicotine, high nicotine, and maybe one in the middle. But it's going to have to be on a case-by-case situation as to how we would look at it and how much information we would need. We try to be reasonable, but it does get tricky. Yeah.
Can I ask another futuristic question?
Sure, go for it.
So let's say I'm anticipating that there are lots of studies being done. We all publish papers using all these different products. We cite what products we use in the papers. It's done with an ITP, but these are not studies that are traditionally, audited by the FDA,
right.
For example, like you would do with a
right.
drug. If tomorrow a company decides to go submit a product to you for approval and cites some of our studies and says that these are the studies that we are basing our findings on, does that now make our studies auditable? And can the FDA, for the purpose of that application, say we need to come audit your work and see how you've done this work? I don't know. So
yeah, I would. Okay, I'm not an office of compliance and enforcement person, but my short answer to that is probably not. Okay, if you're doing the study as an academic researcher and you've followed all the rules that were in place for your academic research at that point in time when you did it, and you published the results of the study, and now the company that's product you used it perfectly legitimately, you did nothing wrong, but they looked at them like, wow, look at that, I'm going to use that. They can. It's published data, it's publicly available, they can use it. But we would look at it and say, yes, but it'd be very difficult for them to use that as their only source of information, because your motivation and logic and reasoning and objective for doing this study was not to get this product on the market. It was whatever purpose you stated. So even some of these, the studies involving the spectrum of the low nicotine research e-cigarette, there's been a lot of studies out there, there's been quite a few publications out there. If they decided they wanted to cite some of that to them, if the company that makes it or some other company decided they wanted to use that information to support marketing a low nicotine cigarette, they can do that. It's publicly available data. But we're going to look at, yes, but how does that apply to your product? And specifically geared towards the way you want it marketed. So they're going to have to draw way more lines other than just, they did this study and it looked good.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you very much.